Hey guys, tonight we slip into the chilly corridors of a medieval castle where the stones themselves seem to remember betrayal. The torches flicker against damp walls, and you can almost hear the echoes of armored boots and whispered treason. You're about to meet Isabella of France, better known to history as the She-Wolf of England. And if you think your own family drama is bad, well, you probably won't survive this one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story, and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and your local time in the comments below, because I love knowing where in the world you're drifting off from. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You shuffle into the Grand Hall of Westminster. The year is 1308, and the scent of spiced wine clings to the air. A teenage bride, Isabella, daughter of the French king, steps forward. She's barely out of childhood, draped in a gown heavy with jewels, her eyes wide as she scans her new English husband, King Edward II. You imagine her heart pounding, not with romance, but with calculation. Because this marriage isn't really about love. It's about politics, alliances, and two monarchies who barely trust each other. From the very beginning, Isabella realizes Edward's affections don't quite belong to her. Historians still argue whether Edward's closest companion, Piers Gaveston, was simply a dear friend or something much more intimate. What's clear is that Isabella found herself competing with a man who wasn't her husband's wife, but acted as though he was England's true queen. You, standing on the sidelines of this royal soap opera, can sense the jealousy simmering, the kind of awkward triangle that could destroy a kingdom. Isabella plays her role well at first. She's praised for her dignity, her French charm, and her ability to smooth over tensions. But beneath the silken veils, resentment coils tighter. Gaveston flaunts his influence, mocking English lords and even gifting himself jewels meant for Isabella. One fringe chronicle even claimed that at a feast, Gaveston wore a gown sewn from cloth Isabella herself had ordered. You can almost hear her teeth grinding behind her polite smile. When the barons finally rise against Edward and execute Gaveston, you might think Isabella would breathe easier. Instead, Edward's affections transfer to another favorite, Hugh Despenser, the younger. And this time, things get uglier. The Despensers hoard land, strip nobles of estates, and treat Isabella herself with disdain. One quirky detail: records note that when Isabella tried to send Christmas gifts to her brother in France, the Despensers blocked her messengers, like medieval in-laws controlling your Wi-Fi password. It's here that Isabella shifts from passive queen to active schemer. In 1325, sent to France to negotiate with her father, she refuses to return. Instead, she allies with an exiled English noble, Roger Mortimer. The whispers around their alliance vary. Was it strategic, romantic, or both? Historians still debate. But together, they hatch a plan that will shake England. Imagine yourself on the coast of Suffolk in 1326. Cold winds whip your cloak as Isabella and Mortimer land with a modest force, but discontented barons flock to her banner. Edward panics, Despensers skitter, and the kingdom tilts. Isabella, once the sidelined queen, now marches in as conqueror. You see peasants staring at her in awe as she rides through villages, the banners of rebellion snapping in the autumn air. Edward II is captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer rule as regents, their power absolute. But power, as always, comes with shadows. Edward II's death in 1327 remains one of medieval history's darkest mysteries. Some accounts claim he was murdered in Berkeley Castle with a red-hot poker, a story so lurid it smells of myth. Others suggest he was quietly smothered or even escaped into obscurity. Scholars today admit we may never know. Still, in your candlelit imagination, the rumors make your skin crawl. At first, Isabella revels in her triumph. She controls England, showers herself with lands, and wears gowns dripping with pearls. Yet arrogance sours. Taxes rise, Mortimer grows despised, and the very nobles who once supported her now whisper against her. In 1330, her teenage son, Edward III, suddenly asserts himself. He storms Nottingham Castle in a daring night raid, seizes Mortimer, and has him executed for treason. Isabella is spared, but forced into a quiet semi-retirement. You picture her there, older, cloaked in widow's black, still regal, yet caged. She spends her final years tending estates, fading into the background of the very kingdom she once ruled with an iron grip. When she dies in 1358, legend says she was buried wearing Edward II's heart, placed in a casket of gilded silver, a macabre, romantic symbol of the man she betrayed. As you let your breathing slow, think about how Isabella's story twists from a neglected bride to a wolfish usurper. Her life reminds you that behind every tapestry-draped throne was a human heart, capable of love, jealousy, and ruthless ambition. And just maybe, when the wind rattles your windows at night, you'll hear the faint growl of the she-wolf of France, prowling through history. The torches of Isabella's England dim behind you, and now your feet crunch along the narrow, winding streets of Naples. The smell of the Mediterranean clings to the air, salt, citrus, and a whiff of incense drifting from a nearby chapel. You're about to meet Joanna of Naples, a queen whose reputation veers between victim and villain, saint and seductress. Imagine a throne room where every smile hides a dagger and every marriage vow doubles as a potential death sentence. Joanna inherited her crown in 1343, barely 16 years old. You'd expect a teenager on the throne to struggle just keeping the crown straight on her head. But Joanna exuded poise that unnerved even her advisors. Still, her world was immediately tangled. She was married to Andrew of Hungary, a young man with royal blood, but a temperament that grated like rusty armor. The marriage was supposed to strengthen ties between Naples and Hungary, but instead, it became a tale of rivalry, whispered insults, and one very suspicious death. Here's the mainstream fact. In 1345, Andrew was found dead, strangled in the gardens of Aversa. No witnesses, no trial, only the soft sound of crickets in the night. And instantly, suspicion swirled like wine in a goblet. Did Joanna plot his murder? Or was it the Neapolitan nobles, sick of a Hungarian prince meddling in their affairs? Historians still argue whether she was the mastermind or merely the scapegoat of a court that never wanted Andrew in the first place. The detail that makes you raise an eyebrow. A chronicler swore that Andrew's body was left dangling from a rope before being cut down. Whether that's true or just grisly exaggeration, you can almost see the scene: a royal garden, moonlit, roses crushed underfoot, and the queen's young husband swinging like a grotesque marionette. Sleep well with that image. Joanna did what queens often had to do in times of crisis: remarry, and quickly. Her second husband was Louis of Toronto, and this time her choice seemed to give her strength. Together, they tightened control, and Joanna proved she wasn't just a decorative figure. She issued laws, mediated disputes, and patronized the arts. Naples bloomed with music, poetry, and philosophy. You could walk through her court and hear troubadours strumming lutes, while scholars argued whether the soul weighed more than a feather. Yet the shadow of Andrew's death never left her. The Hungarian king, Andrew's brother Louis the Great, invaded Naples in 1347 to avenge the murder. Imagine yourself standing on the ramparts as soldiers in steel flood the countryside, the banners of Hungary whipping in the hot wind. Joanna flees to Avignon, clutching her young child. But here comes the quirky tidbit. While in Avignon, she managed to charm Pope Clement VI, convincing him not only of her innocence, but also to formally clear her of any wrongdoing. The Pope even allowed her to sell Avignon itself to the papacy for a handsome price, which makes you wonder, was she a desperate refugee or a shrewd businesswoman playing her cards just right? Returning to Naples, Joanna reclaimed her throne, but her reputation never fully recovered. She ruled for decades, marrying multiple times, each husband seemingly blending into the background while she remained the central figure. Some adored her as a wise patroness who kept Naples cultured and vibrant. Others branded her the Black Widow of Naples, spinning webs of intrigue and strangling anyone who got too close. And yet, the most haunting part of Joanna's reign came at its end. In 1382, Charles of Durazzo, her cousin, stormed Naples, claiming the throne for himself. Joanna was captured and imprisoned in a castle at Muro Lucano. Picture the damp stone walls, the flicker of a candle that barely keeps the darkness at bay. In 1382, she was strangled, just as Andrew had been decades before. Some said it was poetic justice. Others whispered it was the inevitable punishment of a woman who wielded power too boldly in a world that feared such queens. Here's the scholarly debate that lingers. Was Joanna a calculating murderess who eliminated her rivals with silk and poison? Or was she a brilliant yet tragic ruler whose gender made her an easy target for scandal and slander? Even today, historians split along those lines, turning her life into a mirror of their own biases about power, women, and medieval morality. You step out of the prison shadows, hearing only the echo of chains and the faint rush of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Joanna's story drips with contradiction. A queen celebrated as a patron of beauty, yet condemned as a criminal. And as your eyes grow heavy, you realize her tale leaves behind not answers, but a question. When power is wrapped in silk, is it any less dangerous than when it rattles in steel? The southern Italian air fades away, and now you're back trudging through the damp fields of England, where banners whip in the wind and armored horses snort clouds of steam. The 15th century is cracking open, and in its violent heart stands Margaret of Anjou, a woman who refused to sit quietly while men swung swords over her son's inheritance. If Isabella was a wolf, Margaret was a lioness, claws unsheathed, and her roar shook the entire kingdom. Margaret arrived in England in 1445, a teenage bride sent from France to marry the weak and pliable King Henry VI. You picture the marriage ceremony, Henry mild-eyed and hesitant, holding out his hand like a boy who'd rather be reading scripture than leading armies, and Margaret, sharp-eyed, already measuring the crown on her head. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was ambitious. Almost instantly, people noticed her fiery temper and her refusal to play the quiet queen. Henry was not exactly what England wanted in a king. He was pious, scholarly, and, let's be honest, utterly incompetent at ruling. He collapsed into bouts of mental illness, drifting in and out of catatonic states where he didn't even recognize his own son. That son, Edward of Westminster, was Margaret's greatest pride and the axis around which her fury turned. When nobles whispered that Edward wasn't Henry's child at all, but a bastard born of Margaret's supposed affairs, her rage could have fueled an army alone. Historians still argue whether Edward's paternity was ever in doubt, or if it was just propaganda sharpened into a blade against her. And so begins the Wars of the Roses, a name that sounds poetic, until you realize it was one of the bloodiest dynastic struggles in English history. Margaret became the beating heart of the Lancastrian cause. You see her riding at the head of troops, armor gleaming beneath her gown, her hair whipping like a banner. Chroniclers claimed she had the spirit of a man in a woman's body, which back then was both an insult and an admission of awe. Here's the mainstream fact. In 1455, at the First Battle of St. Albans, the conflict ignited. The Duke of York challenged Henry's right to rule, and swords clashed in the streets. Henry was wounded, and Margaret stepped forward as de facto leader of the Lancastrian faction. It's not every day you imagine a queen shouting battle orders while her husband stared blankly at the wall. But that was Margaret's reality. The quirky tidbit: during the chaos, she was rumored to have trained her young son Edward to be merciless. One story claims that as a child, Edward delighted in hearing about executions, even demanding to watch traitors beheaded. Was this the influence of a vengeful mother, or just another piece of Yorkist propaganda? Either way, the image of a boy clapping as heads rolled was enough to terrify England. Margaret's life became a relentless march of exile and return. After defeats, she fled to Scotland, then to France, scraping together armies, pawning her jewels, begging kings for aid. You can almost hear her voice echoing in drafty halls as she pleaded for men and money, her dignity cracking, but her determination never wavering. She was the queen who would not surrender, not even when the odds shrank to nothing. In 1461, the Battle of Towton unfolded, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Picture it: snow falling, fields turning crimson, men slipping on ice slick with blood. The Yorkists triumphed. Edward IV seized the throne, and Margaret fled once more. Yet she refused to disappear. For years, she schemed in the shadows, rallying any who still believed in Lancaster's cause. One of her most infamous acts came in 1459, when Yorkist prisoners were captured. Instead of mercy, Margaret allegedly ordered their executions herself. One chronicler even painted her as gleeful, handing over the men to be butchered in her presence. Was she cruel, or simply wielding the same ruthless justice men did every day? Historians still debate whether Margaret was uniquely bloodthirsty or just uniquely visible. Her story ends not with triumph, but with exhaustion. In 1471, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, her son Edward was killed. Some say cut down in battle. Others that he was captured and executed in cold blood. You can almost feel Margaret's soul crack at that moment. Her entire life's purpose vanishing in a single sword stroke. Captured and brought to London, she was paraded in humiliation. Her fire extinguished at last. She spent her final years in France, penniless, forgotten, muttering through the corridors of a drafty castle. Imagine her walking the halls alone, a once feared lioness reduced to a shadow. She died in 1482, leaving behind a legacy soaked in both admiration and loathing. And so you lie there, listening to the silence, realizing Margaret of Anjou embodied the paradox of power, praised for strength when men wielded it, damned as monstrous when she dared to do the same. Her story lingers like a growl in the back of your throat, a warning, or perhaps a reminder, that crowns weigh heavier on some heads than others. The battle cries of England fade, and now your path winds south into the warm vineyards of Aquitaine. The sun beats golden across rolling hills. Troubadours strum along dusty roads, and in the center of it all stands Eleanor of Aquitaine, a duchess so powerful, so magnetic, that she shaped the fate of 2 kingdoms and scandalized Europe. If Margaret of Anjou was a lioness, Eleanor was a falcon, sharp-eyed, untethered, and always swooping where she pleased. Eleanor was born in 1122, heiress to the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, a region larger and richer than the lands directly controlled by the French crown. Imagine a teenage girl suddenly becoming the most eligible bride in Europe. She had wealth, land, and beauty, like the medieval version of a billion-dollar heiress whose dating life tabloids can't get enough of. Every nobleman wanted her, but it was Louis VII of France who won her hand. Or perhaps we should say, won her lands, since that was the real prize. At first, Eleanor seemed the perfect queen. Cultured, witty, endlessly fashionable. But her marriage with Louis was more comedy than romance. Louis was pious, quiet, and earnest to the point of dullness. Eleanor was vibrant, restless, and politically ambitious. You imagine their dinner table conversations, Louis droning on about prayers while Eleanor rolled her eyes and plotted festivals. Historians still argue whether their incompatibility was personal or political. But either way, sparks flew in all the wrong ways. Here's the mainstream fact. Eleanor accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147, and it turned into a royal disaster. Picture Eleanor in gleaming armor, her ladies dressed as Amazons, marching through the dusty heat of Anatolia. Chroniclers were scandalized. A queen riding at the head of troops, women dressed as warriors. To some, it looked like inspiration. To others, an outrage. And during the campaign, rumors swirled that Eleanor was far too close to her uncle, Raymond of Antioch. Was it a love affair, or simply a strong political alliance? Historians still debate, but either way, Louis was furious. The crusade failed, their marriage unraveled, and Eleanor returned to France ready for something new. In 1152, their union was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. Translation, they were too closely related. But gossip whispered that the real reason was Louis's inability to satisfy Eleanor, both politically and perhaps in other ways. Within weeks, yes, weeks, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, soon to become Henry II of England. Talk about trading up. She went from Queen of France to Queen of England in record time, dragging her duchy of Aquitaine with her. Henry was fiery, ambitious, and just as restless as Eleanor. Together, they forged the powerful Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. You'd think this power couple would conquer the world, but their marriage was as combustible as dry straw near a torch. Henry's notorious womanizing infuriated Eleanor. Quirky tidbit? Chroniclers claimed Henry paraded mistresses in front of her, including Rosamond Clifford, nicknamed the Fair Rosamond. Eleanor allegedly tracked Rosamond to a labyrinth and offered her the choice between dagger or poison. Whether that tale is true or just delicious gossip, it paints Eleanor's reputation in shades of fury and vengeance. But Eleanor's biggest twist came when she supported her own sons in rebellion against Henry. Picture her, now older but still formidable, whispering encouragement into the ears of young princes, Richard, Geoffrey, and even John. In 1173, the sons rose in open revolt, and Eleanor was accused of orchestrating the treachery. Henry had her arrested, and for the next 16 years, she was kept under house arrest, moved between castles like a gilded prisoner, and yet she endured. When Henry finally died in 1189, her son, Richard the Lionheart, ascended the throne. Eleanor emerged from captivity like a falcon loosed from its jesses. She governed in Richard's absence during his crusades, negotiated ransoms, and later supported her youngest son, King John. Even in her 70s, she traveled across Europe arranging marriages and alliances. Can you picture it? An elderly woman on horseback, wrapped in furs, still commanding kings with the sharpness of her gaze. Her death in 1204 closed a life of 90-odd years, an astonishing age for the medieval world. She died at Fontevraud Abbey, where she was buried beside Henry and Richard, her story etched in stone effigies that still lie serenely side by side. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Eleanor a manipulative schemer who sowed chaos wherever she went? Or was she a brilliant survivor who simply refused to be erased by the men around her? Even now, historians tilt their scales differently, some praising her as a proto-feminist icon, others condemning her as reckless. You, standing in the candlelight of Fontevraud's Abbey, realize her shadow stretches longer than the centuries. Eleanor wasn't just a queen. She was a legend in motion, a woman who refused to be silent, who turned marriages and wars into stepping stones for her own legacy. And as you drift closer to sleep, you can almost hear her voice echoing across the vineyards of Aquitaine, sharp, mocking, and forever untamed. The soft chime of Fontevraud's Abbey bells fades into silence, and now your boots splash through the muddy tracks of 12th century England. The air feels heavier, colder, as though the fog itself wants to wrap around your throat. Ahead stands Empress Matilda, the woman who should have been England's first reigning queen, but instead plunged the realm into nearly 20 years of chaos. If Eleanor of Aquitaine was a falcon, Matilda was a storm cloud, dark, relentless, and always on the edge of breaking into thunder. Matilda was the daughter of King Henry I of England, born in 1102, and from the beginning she carried a weighty destiny. As a child, she was shipped off to Germany to marry the Holy Roman Emperor. Picture her, a girl barely 12 years old, draped in silk, suddenly in a court filled with ironclad knights and priests arguing over papal decrees. She learned fast, adopting the title Empress, and it stuck like armor even after her husband's death. When she returned to England, people didn't see a widow. They saw a woman molded into steel. Here's the mainstream fact. When her brother William died in the wreck of the White Ship in 1120, Matilda became her father's only legitimate heir. Henry forced his barons to swear oaths of loyalty to her. Yet in a world where men barely trusted women to manage their own estates, the idea of a woman ruling an entire kingdom was like suggesting you could fry eggs on the moon. Historians still argue whether the barons ever truly intended to honor those oaths, or whether they crossed their fingers behind their backs the entire time. Henry died in 1135, and everything collapsed. Instead of crowning Matilda, the nobles rallied behind her cousin Stephen of Blois. Why? Because he was male, available, and, let's be honest, easier to manipulate. Imagine Matilda's fury when she heard the news. Her crown stolen, not by an enemy, but by her own family. Her eyes must have burned like coals, her hands curling into fists that could never quite unclench. So began the period historians call the Anarchy. Civil war, famine, raiding. England turned into a chessboard where every piece was covered in mud and blood. Matilda gathered loyal forces, crossed the Channel, and struck at Stephen. In 1141, she actually captured him at the Battle of Lincoln. For a brief, shimmering moment, she was on the brink of being crowned. Picture her riding into Winchester, the crowds gawking at a woman in armor, her banner snapping overhead. And here's the quirky tidbit. When Matilda entered London to prepare for her coronation, she demanded enormous gifts, a polite way of saying bribes, from the citizens. She insisted they provide her lavish sums, jewels, and supplies. The Londoners, unimpressed, turned against her. Within days, the same crowd that had welcomed her chased her out with stones. Talk about bad Yelp reviews. The rest of her life was a seesaw of triumph and despair. She was cunning, no doubt, but she struggled with public image. Chroniclers painted her as arrogant, haughty, too masculine, too cold. Was she really worse than her male rivals? Or was it simply that her ambition looked unnatural on a woman's face? Historians still debate whether the problem was Matilda herself or the prejudices of her age. Her greatest escape came that same year. Trapped in Oxford Castle by Stephen's forces in the dead of winter, she faced certain capture. But one snowy night, Matilda, dressed in white cloaks, with a handful of loyal knights, slipped silently across the frozen Thames and vanished into the darkness. You imagine her breath clouding in the cold, her boots crunching softly on the snow, every heartbeat louder than the enemy's horns in the distance. It was the kind of midnight flight that belongs in legend, and somehow she survived. Though Matilda never wore the crown herself, she passed on her claim to her son, Henry Plantagenet, who became Henry II of England. Through him, Her bloodline stretched into centuries of kings, including Richard the Lionheart and John of Magna Carta fame. It's almost ironic. The woman denied her throne gave birth to dynasties that shaped England for ages. Matilda died in 1167, buried at Bec Abbey in Normandy. Her tomb bears the inscription, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in offspring." Not exactly the epitaph she might have chosen, but it's a reminder that while her personal crown was snatched away, her legacy gleamed brighter through her children. As you listen to the hush of the fog settling outside your window, you realize Matilda's story is less about failure and more about endurance. She was the storm that never quite cleared, a queen, almost crowned, whose thunder still rolls faintly across English history. And maybe, just maybe, if you close your eyes, you'll hear her boots crunching on that snowy night. An empress fleeing into legend. The snow and fog of Matilda's England drift away, and suddenly you're standing under the sharp, clear skies of medieval Paris. Church bells echo from Notre Dame. Merchants shout in the bustling markets. And in the royal palace sits Blanche of Castile, a queen mother whose iron will kept a kingdom stitched together when everything threatened to unravel. If Matilda was a storm cloud, Blanche was the steel needle hidden in velvet, elegant on the outside, but sharp enough to pierce any rival who got too close. Blanche was born in 1188, granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, which already tells you stubbornness ran in her blood like wine in the veins. At only 12 years old, she was betrothed to Louis, heir to the French throne. By the time she was a young woman, she had mastered the art of charm, diplomacy, and, let's be honest, intimidation. Chroniclers described her eyes as piercing, the kind that made grown men squirm like naughty schoolboys. Here's the mainstream fact. Blanche became Queen of France in 1223, and only a few years later, her husband King Louis VIII died unexpectedly. Suddenly, Blanche was left as regent for her son, the future St. Louis XIX, who was only 12 years old. You picture her draped in black mourning robes, her crown heavy not just with jewels, but with the weight of ruling a divided kingdom. Most women might have shrunk in such a moment. Blanche sharpened her claws. Immediately, powerful nobles tried to take advantage, plotting rebellions, hoping to seize lands from a child king. Blanche, instead of collapsing, raised armies, negotiated alliances, and, quirky tidbit, was even seen riding on horseback into battle camps, a sight that scandalized lords who thought women should stay behind embroidery hoops. One chronicler claimed she would stare down her soldiers, saying, "Do not forget that the blood of kings runs through my veins." You can almost feel the chill that swept down spines when she said it. Her regency was ruthless. She crushed baronial uprisings with both force and cunning. She bribed where necessary, threatened when needed, and always kept her son's throne intact. Imagine her sitting in the palace council chamber, maps spread before her, bishops whispering in one ear, knights in the other, and Blanche cutting through their babble with a single raised finger. She was not a queen to be dismissed. She was the fulcrum on which France balanced. But what made her truly infamous was her control over her son. Louis IX adored his mother, but many whispered that her influence was suffocating. She monitored his behavior, restricted his companions, and dictated his policies well into adulthood. Historians still argue whether Blanche's guidance forged him into the saintly King France celebrates, or whether it left him a puppet dangling from maternal strings. One particularly strange tidbit comes from rumors about how fiercely she protected her son's purity. Some chroniclers accused her of even keeping potential lovers away from him, surrounding him instead with strict clerics. A darker gossip whispered that her possessiveness veered into unhealthy obsession, though there's no real evidence. Still, it paints a portrait of a queen mother who wasn't content to step aside, but clung to power as tightly as she clung to her son's soul. Blanche also played the game of international diplomacy like a master chess player. She arranged alliances with England, negotiated marriages across Europe, and even faced down the papacy when it tried to muscle into French politics. Once, during a crisis with rebellious nobles, she locked herself inside the castle of Paris with her son and rallied the citizens, swearing she'd rather burn the city to the ground than hand it over. That's not just regency, that's theater. Her later years saw her gradually step back as Louis IX matured. Yet she remained a formidable figure until her death in 1252. When she finally passed, her son wept like a child, and France mourned the woman who had kept the kingdom intact through sheer will. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Blanche the savior of France, a woman who secured the monarchy during one of its most fragile periods? Or was she a manipulative tyrant who never allowed her son or the kingdom to breathe freely? The truth probably lies somewhere between. As you drift deeper into the quiet, picture Blanche's gaze, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the centuries. She was the kind of queen who made the medieval world tremble, not because she wielded a sword, but because she wielded something far more dangerous: relentless resolve. And tonight, if you feel the weight of watchful eyes in the dark, maybe it's just Blanche, making sure you don't stray too far from your place. The bells of Paris toll one last time, and suddenly you find yourself wandering through the gilded yet restless corridors of the French court a century later. The air smells of beeswax candles, roasted meats, and perfume strong enough to cover the stench of unwashed nobles. This is the age of Isabeau of Bavaria, a queen whose name became synonymous with scandal, excess, and whispers of betrayal. If Blanche of Castile was the steel needle, Isabeau was the velvet mask, beautiful, extravagant, and rumored to hide rot beneath the jewels. Isabeau was born in 1370 and married to Charles VI of France at just 16. At first, she seemed the perfect queen, young, dazzling, dressed in brocades that shimmered like starlight. She brought a splash of Bavarian glamour to Paris, and people cheered her beauty in processions. But fate is cruel. Her husband, Charles VI, slipped into madness. He suffered violent fits, sometimes attacking his own men, sometimes forgetting who he was altogether. You picture a king wandering palace halls, barefoot and confused, convinced he was made of glass. Yes, you heard right. He believed he was fragile like glass, terrified that any touch might shatter him into pieces. This left Isabeau at the center of a power vacuum. And here's the mainstream fact. She became regent during Charles's illnesses, though not without controversy. Powerful dukes circled like wolves, eager to control the crown. Isabeau played factions against each other, allying with Burgundy one day, Armagnacs the next, always trying to keep her children's inheritance safe. Yet each move left her reputation more tattered, like a gown dragged through mud. The quirky tidbit? Chroniclers accused her of gluttony and indulgence, saying she threw feasts while the people starved. One rumor even claimed she had a custom-built fattening chair designed to keep her figure plump during famines. Was that true, or just vicious propaganda from her enemies? Historians still argue whether she was really so extravagant or simply painted that way by those who hated a woman exercising power. But the scandal that defined her was more intimate. Whispers spread that Isabeau took lovers, even her brother-in-law, the Duke of Orleans. Was it real, or just a smear campaign in a vicious civil war? Regardless, people remembered her not as a capable regent, but as an adulteress, the bad queen who betrayed her king while he lost his mind. You can almost hear the snickers in smoky taverns, men gossiping over ale about their queen's supposed lovers, while France itself burned around them. And France truly was burning. The 100 Years' War raged, and the English gained ground. In 1420, Isabeau signed the Treaty of Troyes, disinheriting her own son, the future Charles VII, and recognizing Henry V of England as heir to the French throne. To her enemies, this was the ultimate betrayal. A mother selling out her child, a queen surrendering France itself. Imagine her standing in that treaty chamber, quill in hand, her jeweled rings glinting as she signed away her dynasty's future. Did she believe she was securing peace? Or was she cornered, desperate, a pawn forced by circumstance? Historians still debate whether Isabeau was treacherous or tragically pragmatic. The truth is murky. Some records suggest she fought fiercely to protect her children, smuggling them away from danger, bargaining for their safety. Others insist she cared only for her own luxury, abandoning her son to English wolves. The duality is haunting. You can never quite decide if you should pity her or despise her. Isabeau died in 1435, largely forgotten and despised. Her body was laid to rest in Paris, but her reputation lay in ruins. Her name spat as an insult for centuries. Even today, her legacy flickers between caricature and tragedy. So as you lie there in the quiet, imagine Isabeau's shadow drifting across the candle-lit halls, the gleam of jewels, the rustle of silk, and behind it all, the whisper of betrayal. Was she the villain her enemies painted her to be? Or was she simply a queen, trying to survive in a court where madness ruled the king and ambition ruled everyone else? Tonight, you may find her velvet mask hovering in the dark, smiling, but never letting you see what lies beneath. The velvet corridors of Paris dim again, and this time you walk through the perfumed gardens of the Tuileries. Lilies and roses bloom, but the air feels tense, like the fragrance is trying too hard to mask the smell of blood. Here you meet Catherine de' Medici, the Italian-born queen consort of France, widow of Henry II and mother of 3 kings. If Isabeau of Bavaria was accused of betrayal, Catherine was accused of something even more chilling: orchestrating massacres in the name of survival. She's remembered as the Black Queen, though whether her gowns or her heart deserved that title is still argued today. Catherine was born in 1519 to the powerful Medici family of Florence, but she grew up orphaned, raised in the shadow of convent walls. By the time she was married off to Henry, Duke of Orleans, at 14, her worth was measured less in dowry than in dynastic clout. You picture her on her wedding day, dressed in a glittering gown, standing stiffly beside a groom who clearly preferred his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Talk about an awkward honeymoon. Catherine learned early that if she wanted to survive, she couldn't rely on love, only strategy. Here's the mainstream fact. Catherine became queen consort of France when Henry II ascended the throne in 1547, but her true power only emerged after his sudden death in a jousting accident in 1559. Left widowed with 10 children, she maneuvered herself into the role of regent for her young sons. First Francis II, then Charles IX, and later Henry III, all of them wearing crowns too heavy for their heads, all of them guided or shackled by their mother's grip. You can almost see her in the council chamber, dressed in mourning black, her voice cool as she cut through squabbling nobles like a Renaissance HR director dealing with the world's worst staff meeting. Catherine's greatest challenge was the French Wars of Religion, the brutal conflict between Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants. She tried balancing, mediating, offering tolerance one moment and suppression the next. But her most infamous decision, or alleged decision, was the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572. Imagine yourself in Paris. August, heat pressing down, the bells suddenly ringing, and mobs surging through the streets. Thousands of Huguenots, gathered for a royal wedding, were slaughtered in the night. Blood ran into the Seine. Cries echoed through alleys. Catherine's name was tied to the massacre, as if she'd given the order herself. Did she? Historians still argue whether Catherine masterminded the massacre, was pressured into it by militant Catholic advisors, or was simply overwhelmed by panic. Some accounts paint her as cold and deliberate, pointing out that she summoned Protestant leaders to Paris under the guise of peace. Others insist she was cornered in a crisis, forced to choose between letting a plot against her family fester or unleashing violence. Either way, her legacy became soaked in suspicion. The quirky tidbit? Catherine was fascinated with astrology and the occult. She kept court astrologers, including Nostradamus, whose cryptic verses she interpreted as personal guidance. Her gardens at the Tuileries were said to hide secret laboratories where alchemists tinkered with elixirs. One tale even claimed she owned a cabinet of poison rings, jewelry designed to slip venom into a rival's drink. Was that true? Probably not. But it made her sound subtle as a cannon, the sort of queen who could kill you with a compliment and a sip of wine. Catherine's life wasn't all blood and whispers. She was also a patron of the arts, commissioning architecture, ballets, and festivals that dazzled Europe. You stroll through her glittering pageants, fireworks exploding overhead, dancers whirling in satin. Yet the perfume of culture couldn't mask the rot of war. And yes, her perfume budget probably could have bankrupted a small duchy. Priorities, right? As her sons stumbled through reigns marred by rebellion and assassination, Catherine remained the constant presence. She negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and traveled tirelessly across France, often on horseback, even in her 50s and 60s. She was everywhere and nowhere at once, a spider at the center of the web, her black gowns drifting like shadows across the land. By the time she died in 1589, Catherine had lived through an almost unbroken chain of grief. The deaths of her husband, multiple children, endless wars, and the destruction of her reputation. She was buried quietly, without the pomp she might have expected, as if France itself wasn't sure whether to mourn or breathe a sigh of relief. And so the debate lingers. Was Catherine the cruel puppet master who bathed France in blood, or a mother fighting tooth and nail to keep her dynasty alive in a kingdom ripping itself apart? Even now, scholars divide, her reputation shifting like smoke. As you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine her black-clad figure gliding silently through the moonlit gardens, the whisper of her skirts brushing past. Maybe she leans close, murmuring, "It was never about poison. It was always about survival." And whether you believe her or not, the chill that runs down your spine tells you Catherine de' Medici's shadow hasn't faded yet. The moonlit gardens of Catherine de' Medici dissolve, and you now find yourself in the rain-soaked streets of 16th century London. The bells of St. Paul's toll solemnly, smoke drifts from chimneys, and you're about to meet Mary Jai of England, better known to history as Bloody Mary. If Catherine was the Black Queen of France, Mary was the red-stained monarch of England, remembered less for her crown than for the flames that rose during her short reign. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Born in 1516, she grew up in privilege, adored by her father, until Henry's obsession with producing a male heir flipped her life upside down. When he cast Catherine aside for Anne Boleyn, Mary was declared illegitimate. You imagine the little princess, once doted on, suddenly stripped of her title, forced to serve her infant half-sister Elizabeth as a mere lady-in-waiting. That's like going from CEO's daughter to unpaid intern overnight. Here's the mainstream fact. Mary's road to the throne was rocky. After Henry's death, her younger brother, Edward VI, reigned, steering England firmly toward Protestant reforms. Mary, however, remained a devout Catholic, loyal to her mother's faith. When Edward died in 1553, Protestant nobles tried to block Mary's succession, installing Lady Jane Grey as queen. But Mary rallied the people. Yes, rallied, as in marched into London with banners and supporters, and swept Jane off the throne after just 9 days. For the first time in English history, a woman had claimed the crown by force of her own popularity. Her reign, however, is remembered for its brutal attempt to reverse the Protestant Reformation. Mary believed England's soul depended on restoring Catholicism, and she was willing to light the fires herself. Nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake during her 5-year rule, including Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Picture it: the crackle of flames in Smithfield Market, crowds huddling in the smoke, and the accused praying, or cursing, as the fire consumed them. For Mary, these weren't murders. They were sacrifices to save her kingdom's soul. But to her enemies, she became a butcher. Historians still argue whether her cruelty was extraordinary or whether she was simply doing what most rulers of the age would have done in her position. The quirky tidbit: Mary suffered from what doctors now call phantom pregnancies. Twice she announced she was expecting, her belly swelling, her cravings vivid, her court preparing for a royal heir. And twice, nothing happened. Modern scholars suggest it was pseudocesis, a psychological condition. but in her time, it was seen as both tragic and humiliating. Imagine the whispering ladies at court, the sideways glances, the slow realization that the nursery remained empty. It was as if even her own body mocked her hopes. Mary also made a controversial marriage choice. In 1554, she wed Philip of Spain, son of the all-powerful Emperor Charles V. To many Englishmen, this looked like handing the kingdom to Spain on a silver platter. Crowds rioted, pamphlets spread insults, and xenophobic jokes filled taverns. One claimed Mary had traded England's crown for a Spanish sombrero. Those sombreros weren't even Spanish back then. But hey, accuracy was not the goal. Her marriage brought her little joy. Philip found her dull, avoided her bed, and spent much of their marriage abroad. Mary longed for love, but what she got was political calculation. She poured her passion instead into religion, pressing harder for conversions, harder for burnings, harder for England to return to the Catholic fold. But fire couldn't hold back the tide. When Mary died in 1558, childless, her half-sister Elizabeth ascended the throne. Elizabeth I would become the Virgin Queen, a Protestant icon, and history quickly cast Mary as her foil, the cruel, tragic, misguided sister whose reign was an embarrassment to forget. And yet, the scholarly debate lingers. Was Mary truly a bloodthirsty tyrant? Or was she a deeply wounded woman, haunted by rejection, desperate for love, and determined to defend the faith of her mother at any cost? Some modern historians even argue she laid groundwork Elizabeth later built upon, strengthening the navy, reforming coinage, centralizing royal authority. But no one remembers those reforms when her nickname drips with blood. As you close your eyes, you hear the faint hiss of flames in the distance, the crackle of a bonfire that will not die. Mary's ghostly figure lingers at the edge of your dreams, a rosary clutched in her hands, whispering prayers over the embers. She is both pitiful and terrifying, a queen twisted by faith and fear, whose shadow still flickers in the firelight of history. The smoke of Smithfield Market drifts away, and now you find yourself in the echoing halls of Brittany, where the air tastes of salt from the Atlantic and the clash of steel on stone. Here waits Anne of Brittany, the only woman in history to be Queen of France twice, a ruler who turned marriage itself into her sharpest weapon. If Mary I was consumed by fire, Anne was carved from stone, immovable, strategic, and always negotiating. Anne was born in 1477, heiress to the Duchy of Brittany, a fiercely independent land that France longed to swallow whole. From the moment she could walk, every court in Europe wanted her hand, not because of her smile, but because of the duchy she carried in her dowry. Imagine being 12 years old and already treated like the grand prize at a geopolitical auction. Welcome to Anne's childhood. Here's the mainstream fact. At 13, Anne was married by proxy to Maximilian of Austria, the future Holy Roman Emperor. She thought she'd secured a powerful ally to protect Brittany. But France, furious at being outmaneuvered, invaded. The marriage was declared invalid, and Anne was forced to wed Charles VIII of France in 1491. Picture her in the Cathedral of Rennes, small and solemn in a glittering gown, realizing she was marrying the very man who had just conquered her land. That's not a love story, it's a takeover. But Anne was no passive bride. She negotiated fiercely, ensuring that if Charles died without an heir, she would regain Brittany and could remarry freely. And wouldn't you know it, Charles died in 1498 after hitting his head on a low doorway. You can almost hear her muttering, "Mind the lintel," but too late. Quirky tidbit: he supposedly died because he forgot to duck while rushing to watch a tennis match. Not exactly the heroic death ballads are written about. True to her contract, Anne reclaimed Brittany and immediately began negotiating her next marriage. She ended up with Charles's cousin and successor, Louis XII. Once again, she was Queen of France, yet she kept her duchy's autonomy fiercely intact. Some even said she made her second husband bow to her when they argued, a gesture that might sound minor, but in medieval symbolism was dynamite. Anne spent her reign maneuvering like a chess master. She arranged dynastic marriages for her daughters, ensured Brittany remained semi-independent, and used her considerable fortune to patronize the arts. You walk with her through chateaux adorned with elaborate tapestries, illuminated manuscripts, and chapels carved with her personal symbols. The ermine, white and untouchable, a creature whose fur was said to be too pure to be stained. Perfect branding for a queen who wanted to project innocence while practicing ruthless statecraft. The quirky detail? Anne adored books. She commissioned richly decorated manuscripts, one of which included a personal prayer book with tiny illustrations of herself kneeling before the Virgin Mary. Some even show her crowned with a halo of light. Subtle, right? Nothing like commissioning art where you casually appear as God's BFF. Her battles weren't only artistic. Anne fiercely resisted France's attempts to absorb Brittany entirely. Whenever she signed treaties, she ensured clauses protected her duchy's rights. She wore Breton dress at the French court, defiantly marking her difference, as if to say, "You can crown me, but you'll never tame me." Historians still argue whether her resistance truly preserved Brittany or only delayed the inevitable assimilation. Anne died in 1514, exhausted after 16 pregnancies. Yes, 16, though only a handful of children survived. Her body was buried in Paris, but her heart, literally her heart, was placed in a golden reliquary and returned to Brittany. Imagine that, a queen's heart traveling home, carried in solemn procession through the land she had fought to defend all her life. That reliquary, delicate and gleaming, still survives, a symbol of loyalty beyond the grave. And so, Anne of Brittany remains a paradox. Was she a tragic pawn, forced into marriages by invading armies? Or was she a master player, twisting those very marriages into shields for her duchy's independence? Either way, she carved her name into history not through the battlefield, but through the contract, the cradle, and the crown twice over. As you let your breath slow, picture Anne's ermine crest gliding across a velvet banner, white and untouchable, its purity daring anyone to soil it. She whispers from the past, not in rage or passion, but with a steely calm. I was queen twice, but duchess always. And with that, you feel the hush of the Breton tide lapping at your dreams. The Breton tide recedes, and your footsteps now echo in the rocky hills of Lyon, where storm clouds gather over crumbling fortresses. Here, you meet Urraca of Leon and Castile, a queen whose reign in the early 12th century was marked by civil war, betrayal, and a chaos so personal it could be mistaken for theater. If Anne of Brittany was a Duchess of Stone. Urraca was a wildfire, bright, destructive, and impossible to contain. Urraca was born in 1080, daughter of Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile. When her only brother died young, she became heir, an unusual position for a woman of her time. By 1109, after the death of her first husband, Urraca inherited the throne outright. Imagine the shock of barons and bishops alike, an unmarried woman in her late 20s, suddenly ruling one of the most important kingdoms of Iberia. You can almost hear the collective nervous gulp of nobles wondering if their new monarch would tame them or tear them apart. Here's the mainstream fact. Urraca's second marriage was arranged almost immediately to Alfonso I of Aragon, known as the Battler. The union was supposed to unite Leon, Castile, and Aragon into one powerhouse against Muslim-ruled kingdoms to the south. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic royal marriages in history. Both Urraca and Alfonso were fiery, stubborn, and unwilling to yield. Within months, they were fighting, sometimes with words, sometimes with armies. Chroniclers even claimed Alfonso once struck her publicly. You can almost see the horrified faces of courtiers as their royal marriage devolved into a very medieval episode of divorce court. The quirky tidbit: the Pope himself annulled the marriage, citing consanguinity, that catch-all excuse of "you're too closely related." But neither Urraca nor Alfonso cared. They kept fighting, sometimes reconciling briefly, then breaking apart again, their armies clashing as if their vows had simply been battle cries. It was the kind of toxic relationship that makes modern reality shows look tame. Urraca's enemies took advantage of the chaos. Her half-sister, Teresa of Portugal, challenged her, while rebellious nobles rose up claiming she was unfit to rule. Even her own son, Alfonso, later known as Alfonso VII, was pushed forward by factions eager to replace her. Picture Urraca at court, jaw clenched, surrounded by men whispering that she was too proud, too sinful, too womanly to rule. Historians still argue whether her failures were truly her own, or whether she was trapped in a system that refused to accept a female sovereign. And yet, she proved remarkably resilient. Despite civil war and betrayal, Urraca held her throne until her death in 1126. She navigated shifting alliances, sometimes reconciling with her ex-husband, sometimes waging war against him. Once, when besieged in a castle, she supposedly rallied her troops herself, standing on the battlements in armor. Chroniclers painted her as fierce and unyielding, though of course they laced their praise with venom, calling her a woman of the devil for daring to fight like a man. Here's where scholarly debate still rages. Was Urraca truly incompetent? Her reign a disaster that weakened Leon and Castile? Or was she simply judged more harshly because she was a woman ruling alone in a time when kings could make the same mistakes and still be praised as bold? Modern historians lean toward the latter, suggesting that Urraca managed to keep her kingdom intact against impossible odds. The most haunting detail of her story comes at the end. When she died at about 46, her son, Alfonso, succeeded peacefully, becoming one of the most powerful kings of medieval Spain. Urraca had endured humiliation, betrayal, and endless wars. Yet in the end, she passed the crown intact. Her legacy was messy, yes, but also undeniably strong. The quirky rumor? Some chroniclers swore that Urraca was called La Temeraria, the reckless, because of her temper. But others whispered the name came from her personal life, hinting at scandalous affairs. Was she reckless in politics, reckless in love, or both? Historians still argue as though labeling her reckless was easier than admitting she survived a political hellscape that would have broken lesser monarchs. As you let the rhythm of her tale fade, imagine Urraca standing in armor, her hair whipping in the Iberian wind, eyes blazing with defiance. She may not have been beloved, but she was unforgettable. And perhaps tonight, as the wind rattles your window, you'll hear her voice too. Sharp, bitter, unyielding, still fighting for the crown she refused to surrender. The storm of Leon rolls back, and you now step into the grand yet suffocating palaces of Spain at the turn of the 16th century. The air smells of incense, oranges, and iron, the trappings of Catholic piety mixing with the heavy hand of monarchy. Here waits Joanna of Castile, remembered to history as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. If Urraca was reckless fire, Joanna was a candle burning itself down, consumed by grief, obsession, and perhaps the sharp edge of political manipulation. Joanna was born in 1479, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the famed Catholic monarchs who united Spain and funded Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. That's a pretty intense set of parents to live up to. She was never meant to inherit. She was the third child, trained in languages, music, and courtly graces. Picture her as a girl, reciting Latin verses while courtiers whispered she was clever, perhaps too clever for comfort. Here's the mainstream fact. In 1496, Joanna was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Austria. And yes, he was genuinely handsome, with golden hair and a charming smile. Their attraction was instant and fiery. At first, their passion burned so brightly that even cynical ambassadors blushed. But soon, that passion curdled into jealousy, infidelity, and obsession. Philip strayed constantly, flaunting mistresses in front of her. Joanna, fiercely in love, became consumed with rage whenever he betrayed her. Imagine palace corridors echoing with shouting matches, her tears hot, his smirk cold. The quirky tidbit? Chroniclers claimed Joanna once hacked off the hair of one of Philip's mistresses in a jealous frenzy. Others swore she beat her ladies-in-waiting when they teased her about his infidelities. Was it true, or just gossip sharpened into legend? Historians still argue, torn between viewing Joanna as a woman unhinged or as a wife driven mad by humiliation. When her elder siblings died, fate thrust the crowns of Castile and Aragon upon her. Suddenly, she was heir to one of the largest empires in Europe, married to a man who wanted the power but not the partnership. When Isabella of Castile died in 1504, Joanna inherited the throne of Castile. But Ferdinand, her father, doubted her capacity and maneuvered to keep control. Meanwhile, Philip pushed from the other side, eager to rule in her name. Poor Joanna, caught between a domineering father and a faithless husband, was treated less like a queen and more like a pawn. Then came the tragedy that sealed her reputation. In 1506, Philip died suddenly. Some say of typhoid, others whispering poison. Joanna's grief was volcanic. She refused to let his body go. She traveled across Castile with his coffin, night after night, refusing burial, opening the casket to gaze at him, kissing his cold lips. One story claimed she only allowed female attendants, locking out men for fear they might lust after her dead husband. Picture a midnight procession, torches flickering, oxen dragging a coffin through the mud, a queen weeping as though her soul itself had been buried. Was this madness, or was it weaponized rumor, spread by those who found her inconvenient? Historians still debate. Some modern scholars suggest Joanna was more sane than she appeared, but political rivals, her father, and later her son, Charles V, had every reason to exaggerate her instability to keep her sidelined. After all, labeling a woman mad was the perfect way to strip her of authority without a sword being drawn. The truth is heartbreaking. Joanna spent nearly 50 years imprisoned in the fortress of Tordesillas. Imagine the cold stone walls, the iron locks, the narrow window that let in little light. She aged there, largely forgotten, while her son Charles became Holy Roman Emperor, ruling half of Europe in her name. The quirky rumor, even in her later years, townsfolk swore they could hear her singing lullabies through the barred windows, as if still soothing the ghost of her beloved Philip. Others claim she refused to bathe, letting her grief cling to her like a second skin. Whether true or not, the image of a queen pacing endlessly in captivity has haunted Spain ever since. When she died in 1555, her body was laid to rest beside Philip's, the husband she had adored, hated, and mourned to the point of legend. And so, the scholarly debate endures. Was Joanna truly insane, broken by jealousy and grief? Or was she a victim of a patriarchal system that found it easier to call her mad than to let her rule? You, listening now in the quiet, realize both answers may be true, that love can unmake even the strongest crown, and grief can twist a queen into a ghost while she still breathes. As your eyes grow heavy, you hear the clatter of wheels on a stony road, the creak of a coffin being dragged through the night, and the faint sound of a woman's voice, whispering to a husband who will never answer. Joanna the Mad walks still, in memory, if not in flesh. The mournful clatter of Joanna's coffin procession fades, and now you stand beneath the pale northern sky of 17th century Sweden. The air is sharp with pine and frost, the Baltic winds tugging at your cloak. Here comes Christina of Sweden, a queen who baffled, scandalized, and astonished Europe with her eccentric ways. If Joanna was a candle burning itself out, Christina was a comet, brilliant, erratic, and impossible to predict. Christina was born in 1626, the only surviving legitimate child of King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's warrior king. When he died in battle in 1632, Christina, just 6 years old, was proclaimed his heir. Imagine the hush over Stockholm, a tiny girl in ermine robes, dwarfed by the throne, her tutors already whispering that she must grow up sharper, faster, stronger than any boy. And she did. Christina devoured books, mastered languages, and impressed foreign ambassadors with her wit. One visitor noted she spoke as if she were born for argument. You can almost see her, eyes sparkling, tossing quips that left old men red-faced and sputtering. Here's the mainstream fact. Christina became queen regnant at 18, ruling Sweden in her own right. But she never fit the mold. She rejected marriage, calling it shackles. She dressed in men's clothing, rode horseback with the swagger of a prince, and surrounded herself with intellectuals, poets, and philosophers. Descartes himself came to her court, though, quirky tidbit, he soon died in the Swedish winter, which he hated. Some joke that Christina literally bored him to death with 5 a.m. philosophy debates in freezing castles. The scandals grew. She flirted with both men and women, scandalizing the court with her ambiguous affections. One courtier described her as more a man than a woman, not only in intellect, but in appearance and mannerisms. Was she queer, gender nonconforming, simply eccentric, or all of the above? Historians still argue, fascinated by the way Christina shredded every expectation of a 17th century queen. Her politics were just as unorthodox. Though Sweden was a fiercely Protestant nation, Christina secretly converted to Catholicism, a decision she kept hidden for years. She believed Catholic culture was richer, more refined, more aligned with her love of art and philosophy. But she knew declaring this openly could endanger her throne. Instead, she plotted her escape. In 1654, she shocked the world by abdicating. Picture it, a grand ceremony in Uppsala, Christina stepping down from the throne, removing her crown, her scepter, her robes of state, and declaring she would no longer be queen. Her cousin Charles Gustav took over, while Christina slipped away, disguised in men's clothes, heading south across Europe. This abdication was so unprecedented, it stunned every court in Europe. Monarchs did not quit. Monarchs died on their thrones. But Christina, always contrary, decided she preferred art, philosophy, and independence over ruling. Once free, she traveled across Europe, dazzling and shocking in equal measure. In Rome, she converted publicly to Catholicism, becoming a darling of the papal court. She hosted salons filled with painters, scientists, and poets. Yet her eccentricity never dimmed. She fought duels, interfered in papal politics, and once allegedly ordered the assassination of a courtier who betrayed her. The quirky rumor? She once tried to seize the throne of Naples with papal backing, dreaming of ruling a new kingdom. The scheme failed, but it shows how Christina could never sit still. She was always reinventing herself, a queen in exile who remained somehow more famous than many reigning monarchs. She died in Rome in 1689, buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of only 3 women to ever receive that honor. Think about that, a Protestant-born queen, gender-bending, scandalous, eccentric, buried at the heart of Catholicism itself. And so, the debate continues. Was Christina a failed monarch, her reign brief and erratic? Or was she a visionary who refused to be caged by expectations, living life on her own terms centuries before anyone dared speak of such freedom? Historians still argue, but one thing is certain. She is remembered not for losing a throne, but for walking away from it. As your breathing slows, imagine Christina slipping through the snow in her men's cloak, smiling slyly, eyes glinting with mischief. She whispers to you across time, "Better to rule myself than a kingdom." and with that, she vanishes into the night, leaving only the faint sound of horse hooves crunching on frozen ground. The crunch of Christina's horse hooves fades into silence, and now you find yourself in the shadowed courts of medieval Portugal. The air here is heavy with incense from monasteries and the salt of the Atlantic drifting in from the west. In these narrow halls, where whispers can cut as sharply as swords, stands Maria of Portugal, a queen who might not be as well known as Catherine de' Medici or Isabella of France, but whose reign was marked by violence, heartbreak, and a tragic spiral that left scars on her kingdom. If Christina of Sweden was a comet streaking unpredictably, Maria was a storm-tossed ship, veering wildly between fragile calm and devastating wreckage. Maria was born in 1521, daughter of Manuel of Portugal and Eleanor of Austria, placing her directly in the crosswinds of European dynastic politics. By marriage, she became Queen of Castile when she wed Philip, son of the future Emperor Charles V. It was meant to be a steady alliance, binding Iberian powers together. But Maria's life was anything but steady. From the very beginning, her health and her mind were fragile, described as melancholic and volatile, even by sympathetic chroniclers. Here's the mainstream fact. Maria's bouts of instability grew more pronounced over time, and her reign quickly acquired a reputation for disorder. Courtiers whispered that her moods could swing from sweetness to violence in a breath. She was known to lash out, sometimes physically, at those around her. Unlike queens, remembered for calculated ruthlessness, Maria's cruelty seemed unpredictable, like lightning that struck wherever it pleased. The quirky tidbit? One account claimed she once hurled dishes at her servants during a banquet, shrieking at imagined insults. Another said she tore tapestries from palace walls in fits of rage, convinced they were watching her. Were these true events, or exaggerated tales spread by enemies who found it convenient to paint her as unhinged? Historians still argue whether Maria was genuinely unstable or the victim of a propaganda campaign that magnified every eccentricity into evidence of madness. Her troubles weren't confined to court drama. Maria's erratic governance spilled into politics. Nobles clashed over influence. Rebellions stirred at the edges of the kingdom, and foreign allies began to treat Portugal with wary condescension. Imagine the council chamber, advisors fidgeting nervously, trying to coax a reasonable decision from a queen whose eyes glittered with suspicion. Every word she spoke teetering between brilliance and incoherence. And yet, Maria wasn't without moments of competence. At times she could be decisive, even shrewd, negotiating treaties and approving reforms. This duality, sharp intellect buried beneath unstable emotions, makes her one of history's most haunting enigmas. One moment, she could charm foreign ambassadors with eloquent speeches, and the next, retreat to her chambers in trembling paranoia. Here's the scholarly debate. Was Maria truly mad, suffering from a genuine psychological disorder worsened by the isolation of court life? Or was her reputation twisted by misogynistic chroniclers who found a powerful, erratic woman easier to demonize than to understand? Modern historians lean toward the former, diagnosing in hindsight what might have been severe depression, bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia. But in her own time, there were no such diagnoses, only fear and slander. Maria's decline deepened in her later years. She withdrew from governance, leaving factions to tear at one another. She became increasingly secluded, clinging to religious rituals, sometimes spending hours locked in prayer, sometimes screaming in the night. Her court grew hushed, servants tiptoeing as though living with a storm that could break at any moment. When she died in 1577, Portugal breathed both relief and sorrow. Relief, because her reign of turbulence had finally ended. Sorrow, because even in her instability, she was still their queen, and her suffering had been palpable. She was laid to rest in Lisbon, her legacy overshadowed by whispers of madness and cruelty. And so, Maria of Portugal lingers in history's shadows, remembered less for her policies than for her instability. Was she a violent tyrant, a tragic victim of untreated illness, or both? You, lying in the dark, feel the weight of her presence like the hush before a storm. Imagine her pale face in candlelight, eyes burning with suspicion, lips trembling with unsaid words. She leans toward you from the centuries, not with the roar of a lioness or the cold smile of a schemer, but with a voice that quivers between reason and madness. They all said I was broken, but broken glass still cuts. And with that chilling whisper, the storm of Maria fades, leaving only the faint scent of salt and incense to drift into your dreams. The salt and incense of Lisbon drift away. And now, your feet crunch on frosted soil in the dark forests of Hungary. The moon filters through bare branches, and wolves howl in the distance. Here you meet Elizabeth Bathory, the infamous Blood Countess, whose legend has soaked into history like red wine into linen. If Maria of Portugal was broken glass, Elizabeth was a blade gleaming in candlelight, sharp, cruel, and terrifying in the imagination of all who heard her name. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families of Transylvania. Wealth, castles, and servants were hers from birth. She married Ferenc Nadasdy, a wealthy nobleman known as the Black Knight of Hungary. While Ferenc was off at war, Elizabeth managed their vast estates, and it was here her legend began to curdle. Here's the mainstream fact by the early 1600s. Rumors spread that young servant girls were disappearing around her castle. The whispers claimed Elizabeth lured peasant daughters with promises of work, only for them to vanish forever. Testimonies later accused her of torture, beating, burning, even freezing victims in snow. The most infamous tale, of course, was that she bathed in their blood, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. Picture the stone corridors lit by flickering torches, crimson-stained basins tucked into corners, and Elizabeth's pale hands gliding through the liquid as if it were silk. The quirky tidbit: some villagers swore that once Elizabeth grew so enraged at a maid who tugged too hard at her hair while brushing it, she struck her so hard blood splattered onto her skin. Seeing her reflection in a mirror, Elizabeth supposedly thought her flesh looked younger where the blood had touched, and thus began her horrific obsession. Whether that detail is truth or myth, it has become the seed of every vampire legend that sprouted in Eastern Europe. But was Elizabeth truly the monster folklore made her historians still argue? Some say she was guilty of killing scores of girls, making her one of the earliest recorded female serial killers. Others argue she was the victim of a political conspiracy. After all, Elizabeth was immensely wealthy, and her lands were prime targets for rivals. Accusing a powerful widow of unspeakable crimes would have been an efficient way to strip her wealth and silence her influence. The numbers are staggering. Some claims said she killed over 600 girls, though historians today consider that figure inflated by gossip. The trial records included testimony gathered under torture, a method not exactly known for producing reliable truth. Yet even if exaggerated, the sheer consistency of stories suggests some dark deeds did happen behind the walls of Castle Chaktitz. Imagine walking those halls today, their stones damp with centuries of silence. You hear whispers in the dark, the scrape of iron chains, the faint cries of young voices echoing through time. Whether fact or fiction, the legend feels too heavy to ignore. Elizabeth's downfall came in 1610, when King Matthias II finally moved against her. She was never formally tried. Instead, she was walled up in her chamber at Chaktitz Castle, sealed behind bricks, with only small slits for food and air. For 4 years, she lived entombed in stone, pacing the narrow space, whispering to herself, perhaps still convinced of her innocence, or perhaps savoring memories of cruelty. She died in 1614, alone in the dark, her body eventually buried in the family crypt, though villagers later dug it up and moved it in fear her grave cursed the land. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Elizabeth Bathory a sadistic killer who turned her castle into a slaughterhouse? Or was she the victim of misogyny and greed, her legend inflated to justify her imprisonment? Modern historians still can't agree, though the image of the Blood Countess has stuck more firmly than any nuanced truth. As your eyelids grow heavier, picture the cold stones of Chaktitz pressing close, the scrape of a bowl sliding through a hole in the wall, and the faint, chilling laugh of a woman who may or may not have bathed in blood. Elizabeth whispers across centuries, her voice smooth as silk and sharp as a blade. They wanted a monster, so I became one. And then, as the forest wolves howl once more, her shadow slips back into legend, leaving only the echo of dripping water and the icy chill of unease. The wolves of Hungary fade, and now you find yourself in the golden dusk of Renaissance Italy. Marble palaces rise on every side, their windows glowing with candlelight, while soft music drifts through courtyards perfumed with orange blossoms. Here waits Lucrezia Borgia, the most infamous daughter of the notorious Borgia clan. If Elizabeth Bathory was a blade, Lucrezia was the vial of poison hidden in a jeweled ring, subtle, whispered about endlessly, and feared whether the tales were true or not. Lucrezia was born in 1480, daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who would later become Pope Alexander VI. Yes, you heard right. Her father was a pope, though the Borgias were never known for celibacy. The family's reputation was already steeped in corruption, simony, and scandal, and Lucrezia became both pawn and player in their deadly games. Here's the mainstream fact. Lucrezia's marriages were tools of diplomacy. Her father and brother, Cesare Borgia, used her like a chess piece, moving her from one alliance to another. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, was annulled after the Borgias claimed he was impotent, a humiliation that stuck like tar. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was murdered, likely on Caesare's orders. Rumors claimed Lucrezia herself poisoned him, though more sober historians point the finger at her ruthless brother. The quirky tidbit? Whispers swirled that the Borgias owned a hollow ring filled with poison, which Lucrezia supposedly used to discreetly tip powders into cups at feasts. Was it true, or just one of the many rumors that clung to her like perfume? Historians still argue, some insisting she was a murderess, others arguing she was the scapegoat of her family's dark reputation. But Lucrezia was more than a pawn. As Duchess of Ferrara, through her third marriage, she became a respected patroness of the arts. She supported poets like Ariosto, commissioned churches, and turned her court into a glittering hub of Renaissance culture. Picture her walking through Ferrara's grand halls, gold-threaded gown sweeping marble floors, a book of poetry in one hand and a wary smile in the other. She was no longer just the Pope's daughter. She was a duchess with influence of her own, and yet the darker rumors never faded. Some claimed she had incestuous relationships with her father and brother, stories so scandalous that they read like salacious plays. Modern scholars dismiss these tales as slander spread by enemies of the Borgias, but the whispers stuck, shaping her image as the ultimate femme fatale. One moment, she was praised as a saintly duchess, the next painted as a seductress with a vial of poison always at hand. Her later life, though, tells a different story. Lucrezia devoted herself to her children, to charitable works, and to her duchy. Letters show her as deeply religious, caring, even weary of the scandals that dogged her youth. She suffered multiple difficult pregnancies, and in 1519, at the age of 39, she died after giving birth. Those who saw her in her final years described her as pale, melancholy, and pious, a far cry from the wicked witch of rumor. And here's the scholarly debate. Was Lucrezia truly twisted, complicit in her family's corruption, a poisoner and seductress? Or was she merely the victim of a smear campaign so potent that it outlived her by centuries? Historians still wrestle with the contrast between the saintly Duchess of Ferrara and the Borgia she-devil of gossip. As you lie still, you can almost feel her presence. A woman in golden silk, her fingers brushing the rim of a goblet, her eyes glancing sideways to see if you're watching. She leans close, her whisper soft as incense smoke. I was not the poison. I was the cup they filled. And now, with Lucrezia's shadow fading into the twilight of Renaissance Italy, you feel the stories of all these queens gathering like a tapestry around you. Wolves and widows, saints and sinners, mothers and monsters. Each one twisted, not only by her own choices, but by the hands of those who told her story. The hour grows late, and it's time for a gentler closing. The torchlight dims, the voices of queens soften into echoes, and the weight of centuries lifts from your chest. You drift now through the quiet corridors of memory, where crowns rest on empty thrones, and the whisper of silk fades into stillness. The fire that burned in Isabella, the grief that consumed Joanna, the cunning of Catherine, the defiance of Urraca, all of it settles into silence, leaving you only with the calm rhythm of your own breath. The queens are gone, their shadows folded back into history. All that remains is the hush of the night, the steady darkness that no longer threatens but soothes. You are safe now, warm in your bed, far from the cold stones of castles and the sharp whispers of courts. The world outside sleeps, and so should you.